What is one of the most terrifying experiences you had, or have had, in your childhood? When I was about 6, my dad offered me as collateral to a gas station owner about 30 minutes away from my house. He said he'd come back and pay, which surprisingly he did, but for an hour I was stuck alone with a man I didn't know, in a place I didn't know, in the middle of nowhere. I'll never forget the eternity I spent staring at the tiled floor, waiting for my father to come back. We accidentally left my sister at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. We used to travel around in an RV for vacations. We stopped to get gas and my father did a head count. We told him my sister was in the bathroom. He thought we meant the RV bathroom, but it was the gas station bathroom. So he left. No one realized she wasn't actually in the RV for maybe 10 minutes, so she was there alone at a gas station at 10 years old for probably 30 or so minutes before we could get back. This was 1980, so long before cell phones. When I was about 14, I was leaving a friend's apartment across town pretty early in the morning. I was sitting at the bus stop waiting for the bus when this guy in his late 20s or early 30s stopped and asked if I would like a ride because the buses didn't start running for a couple more hours. He seemed totally normal, and the car looked expensive, so I said sure. Creepy people don't drive nice cars, right? The car ride should have been about 10 minutes, so we made small talk, and as we came up to my street I gave him plenty of warning to turn right. He drove right by it. He apologized and said he'd turn on the next one. He didn't. At this point I started getting nervous and said something to the effect of "WTF, man." At this point he said, "I have to confess, I picked you up because I thought you were cute." I responded with, "Well, I'm 14 and not gay, so let me out." He profusely apologized and swore he would take me straight home. He started driving in the right direction, and I directed him to the closest public area I saw, and got out. This one's funny in retrospect, and it's not like it traumatized me or anything, but once when I was little and messing around in the garage I found a bucket of gray dusty looking stuff. I called my sister over and proceeded to stick my arms in it. She was reluctant to do so, because we didn't know what it even was, but eventually put her hands in as well. After a couple of minutes my dad comes running in and yells at us something along the lines of, "Quick, get your hands out of there. That's rat poison." We immediately do so, and my older sister, in a very quiet voice, goes, "Are we gonna die?" My dad looked between the both of us and very somberly nodded and said yes, and we proceeded to burst into tears. It was just a bunch of stone dust. He felt bad for the prank later, but I wouldn't be surprised if he still finds it hilarious. My dad left me in a child safety locked pickup truck when I was about 6 or 7. It wasn't hot out, it was maybe April, but it was in the sun. It was in our own driveway. He had run back in to get something before leaving and then forgotten about me and the errands, and started watching TV. First I cried, because I thought I was going to die, though I thought I was going to be dehydrated and die that way. Then I figured out a plan. The driver's side window was slightly cracked, and I somehow managed to MacGyver the door open from the outside using some gardening stuff that had been by his feet. I had to slam myself against the door though and ate shit on the gravel when I got out. But I was still super proud of myself for having escaped. I felt like Violet Baudelaire. I ran inside to tell my dad what happened, and he basically responded that he would have remembered I was there and I would have been fine, and my scrapes were my own fault for being so impatient. Anyway, to this day I'm very good under pressure and good at jury-rigging. And I don't talk to my dad anymore. When I was 14 I woke up paralyzed. Started screaming and freaking out, got taken to ER. The doctors put in me the psych ward, saying that there was no physical reason I couldn't move, but they could tell I believed I can't move, because they were stabbing me with things and I wasn't reacting, etc. After lots of arguing from my parents, eventually get MRI, etc. Turns out I have temporal lobe epilepsy, and it was a type of seizure called Todd's paralysis, where you have a seizure in your sleep, and your brain and body temporarily lose connection after. My dad was an alcoholic, and that caused my parents' divorce. My sister and I would go over to his house every other weekend, and it was always the same thing. He would get drunk and pass out, leaving us with nothing to do or eat. My sister stopped going over, but I was younger so I still had blind faith and trust in my dad. One of the times he was very drunk and pointed his gun to me and even put his knife against me. Eventually he went to rehab and moved to another city for work, and he got remarried. When my sister and I went to visit him a few years later, he relapsed. He got drunk and started yelling, throwing pans at us, and eventually the cops came and he went to another rehab. He has been sober for many years now, and is doing much better. Still though, I don't think our relationship will be the same. I had a horrible childhood, just really bad. I have learned to have a sense of humor about things. I think I was between 5 or 7, somewhere around there. Cops knew my house because they would get called there. I had also already been taken away from my mom because of the stuff she did. I have no idea or memory of what I did to piss her off. It was windy that night, and for some reason the wind would always freak my mother out. That night it was super windy and my mother was listening to Ozzy Osbourne very loud too. That's what I woke up to, my mother listening to Ozzy very very loud. The cops were called. I remember 2 cops coming over. I was at my mother's feet, but the cops didn't know it at the time. I remember thinking that I had to be super quiet and not make a sound or I would be in trouble and that my mother would hit me and punish me. Cops tell my mother to turn the music down and stuff. Cop kicks a box at my mother's feet. Just a freakish thing to do. It was one of those boxes that you put blankets in. It was a rich blue with brass trim. I make a noise and the cop freaks out. Ever seen that movie 7? What's in the box? Yup, there you go. Cop was freaking out, telling my mother to remove the lock and open the box. The cop told my mother he would shut the box. My mother finally opened and there I was. My mother had wrapped me up in a white blanket, my knees were in my chest and I had metal leg braces. I had my stuffed pink pig and I wanted my teddy bear Fluffy. I was terrified of what my mother was going to do to me. The cops took me to McDonald's and fed me. I had 2 Happy Meals and then took me to a place where abused children go. That's one of my scariest childhood memories. Didn't know what was worse, my mother or the foster home. I was walking home from school one day in my home country when I noticed several policemen running down the street. I didn't give it a second thought until I saw a group of government soldiers running in the opposite direction on an adjacent street. I thought it must have been a group of well-armed thugs robbing a store or something. As I approached my house, I saw 2 men laying on the ground. They were both dead. One had deep, blue eyes. It looked like they were staring at the sky. Besides the lack of movement in their slack jaws, there was no blood or anything to indicate they were dead. I ran home scared and terrified. I arrived to my family packing the van. My mom hugged me tightly and cried. She told me that the school had been overrun and that she thought I had died. We left for the airport in a city gripped with chaos. Strewn everywhere was clothing and abandoned possessions. Government vehicles riddled with bullet holes and the burned-out husks of tanks littered the streets. My dad drove like a maniac trying to reach the airport. It was the most heavily guarded installation in the city besides the presidential palace. We arrived to find the main terminal tightly packed with people. We slowly made our way to customs. My dad is a naturalized citizen of the US, as is my mother, so we were able to leave without much problems. As we sat on the tarmac waiting to take off, I noticed something I will never forget. The heavily armed soldiers guarding the perimeter of the airport started to undress themselves down to their underwear, some even more than that. I could see them throwing away their weapons and running away from their post. Some even tried to climb the airport fence. As we took off, I could see the city on fire. My aunt, who escaped after the war, told us that the rebels had infiltrated the city a week before and had begun the attack by assassinating a government general and a police chief that lived in our neighborhood. My uncle, a soldier, grabbed his rifle and ran into the fight, never to be seen again. It turns out that those who hadn't boarded an airplane in time were massacred at the airport or were forced to join the rebels. I'll never know how close my family and I were to dying that day. Our upstairs neighbor, who was also our apartment maintenance man, attacked his girlfriend with a knife. Her daughter and her friend ran downstairs to our apartment yelling and crying, "He killed my mom! He killed my mom!" The police were called but he fled the scene, so they just issued a warrant for his arrest. He was never jailed for attempted murder. A little while after this occurred, I want to say a good year or so, he finally went to jail for other reasons and his girlfriend fled to another state hours away. When I was 11, my family went to my aunt's house for my cousin's grad party. After a while I had to pee, so my aunt took me into the bathroom and then left. After I was done I opened the door to leave and I noticed my cousin's huge black lab Dino was laying on the floor of the kitchen between me and the front door. I was nervous but I figured I'd just walk over him and took a step into the kitchen. Dino growled, so I decided to detour around the kitchen table instead. Except halfway across the room Dino lunged out from under the table and pinned me against the counter, growling and barking and baring his teeth at me. I was terrified. I started shaking and crying and screaming for my aunt at the top of my lungs, but she couldn't hear me outside because of the party. Every time I tried to move to run, he'd lunge and snap at me again. I was stuck there for probably 5 or 10 minutes before my dad decided it was time to go and asked my aunt if she'd seen me, and she finally came back to check the bathroom. She saw what was happening and called the dog off and gave me a big hug, but I had nightmares for a month and now black labs still make me very nervous to be around. When I was really young, probably 4 or 5, I used to have this terrifying recurring nightmare. It was always the same. My family and I would go to the local movie store to rent a movie and make a night out of it. Every time, my mom couldn't decide which movie she wanted, so she asked the man behind the desk for a recommendation. He handed her a blank DVD with no title or anything. We proceeded home, prepared popcorn, and got settled in. My mom would put the DVD in, press play, and I would collapse onto the ground, convulsing and terrified. As soon as I came out of the spell, my mom would exclaim that was so exciting, let's do it again. Every night I would have these dreams, and the cycle would repeat itself until I could force myself awake. It got to the point that I was terrified to fall asleep. Eventually it stopped and I actually completely forgot about the dream, until one day I got absurdly stoned, listened to some weird song called Go Away, and started having a seizure IRL. During the seizure the memories of the dreams flooded into my mind, and I was traumatized all over. Very bizarre experience. I think it was a dream because all my childhood memories are super fuzzy, but, when I was like 5 or 6 I was at a family thing at my grandparents' house. I went to their back bathroom to pee. As I'm zipping up my tiny pants the shower curtain started moving. I looked at it and I swear it jumped at me, screamed, and it looked like the shape of a person. I cried and ran and told my family what happened, but I don't remember anything after that. But I still remember that feeling of fear. Terrifying isn't the right word for this, maybe surreal? Or disturbing? Anyway, when I was in 5th grade I had a bike accident where I fell and hit my head on the sidewalk, wasn't wearing a helmet. I survived, obviously, but it was a long recovery. I was in the ICU for almost a week, in the hospital for nearly a month, had to do physical therapy for almost a year. Anyway, about a year after my accident I was walking home from school by myself and came upon the scene of a bike accident of a kid who was in high school. By the time I got there the ambulance was there, but I saw the kid, who was unresponsive, and him getting loaded into the ambulance, and there was blood all over the curb and side of the road. I never told my parents what I saw, was worried it would freak them out seeing as something similar happened to me just a year earlier. But I did find out later, from a friend, that the kid died. He had fallen off his bike and hit his head on the curb, no helmet, and there you go, 14 years old and dead. What was surreal about the whole experience was seeing this kid getting put into the ambulance. At the time I had this weird feeling of like, so this is what it must have felt like for my parents, even though they weren't at the scene of my accident and only found out after I had been taken to the hospital. But it was almost like an out-of-body experience, like I was reliving my accident, but seen from a bystander's viewpoint. I don't know, kind of hard to explain, but definitely a weird feeling that I still remember some 30 years later. And even to this day I've never told my parents about witnessing that accident, but I still vividly remember the boy lying there, what color hair he had, the blood-stained curb when he was moved to the ambulance. Definitely one of the most vivid memories of mine from childhood. I'm a girl, but I had a short time when I was around 13, where I was addicted to internet porn. Anyways, one day it was early morning before school. It was about 6:45, and my mom didn't get up until 7 o'clock, so even though my earbuds were missing, I figured I could watch a few short pornos before she got up. I searched my favorite sites and found nothing that looked particularly good, so I just decided to use Google to try and find something good, making sure to delete my search history every few minutes, and I found this weird scat fetish site. I unfortunately don't quite remember the name of the site, I just remember clicking on one of the links and finding a really poorly put together site, just a yellow background with pages full of blurry and low quality videos and blue hyperlinks. Anyways, I clicked on a random one, and it opened. I won't get into details, but it wasn't very hot, more disgusting in my opinion. At this point it was around 6:55, and I had to get ready for school, so I switched to a different tab and closed the one with the weird video, but the moaning from the video didn't stop. I panicked and closed the entire Safari app. The moaning continued. I was really scared. I could hear my mom getting out of bed and the volume buttons were doing nothing to stop the audio. I banged my phone against the table, really scared now, and broke the screen protector. I stuffed my phone into the couch cushions, just as my mom came out of her room. At that point, the Safari app crashed and the moaning stopped. My mom couldn't figure out why I was in such a tizzy, or why I had broken the screen protector on my cell phone. Still one of the scariest and funny experiences I've had to this day. When I was 18, my best friend and I went to a New Year's party. She had told me we would be staying at her parents' place. I lived 2 hours drive away, which was fine. But when the party ended, she said we couldn't stay at her parents' house because they would get angry she was drunk. So we went to her parents' empty investment property. About 30 minutes drive out from her parents' current house. It had a shed in the backyard which her older brother used to sleep in a few months earlier, so had a bed and that's about it. We had to climb over the fence to get into the shed because she didn't have the key for the fence. About an hour later we heard cars pulling up outside, which was fine. There were other houses in this street and it was New Year's. People were getting back home late. We heard a bottle smash just outside and at this point I started freaking out. We heard someone jump over the fence and walk quietly up to the door. No one had spoken a word and my best friend and I were now hugging each other in total fear. Like, why the hell were there people in the backyard? And then someone started knocking on the door quietly and trying to open it. Then they started banging and then they put a flashlight on and were trying to see through the windows and under the door. We hadn't made a noise or said anything, too scared. And either had this mysterious person/us. If it was police, for example, and a neighbor had called to report a break-in, because maybe they had seen us climbing over the fence, then the police would say it was them whilst knocking. Eventually this person/us left and I was hyperventilating and freaking out that I was going to be murdered. I have never let her forget that she put me in this situation, ha ha ha. Was at Six Flags, got on a new roller coaster called Serial Thriller, was a small human. The harness released about 2 clicks and I was slowly slipping out of it. I rode it again. My mother lost me in a Walmart once when I was little. The kicker, though, is that because she was abusive, and would later develop narcissist traits as I grew older, I genuinely thought she would leave me, an autistic 5-year-old, alone in that Walmart and never come back for me. Hell, it's still a legitimate fear today, no matter whom I'm with. I'm 20 and I still fear someone whom I ride with to a store would leave me stranded for no reason other than the fact they hate me. This might not seem that bad to some, but it was a nightmare to me. When I was a kid, my mom was single and worked 2 jobs to support us, which meant being on my own for most of the day, which, before this experience, used to be fine. One evening while I was waiting for my mom to come home, a really nasty storm swept through our area. High winds, pouring rain, lightning crashing down every few seconds. Normally I wouldn't be bothered. I live in Florida, so storms are normal. But as I was watching cartoons, a warning for a tornado scrolled across the screen. It was then I noticed how bad the storm actually was. The lights began to flicker and the wind outside was making a horrible sound that to my 10-year-old brain sounded like a monster. I felt really afraid for the first time being alone. I wanted nothing more than for my mom to come home because I didn't know what to do. Worst part was it was becoming night out. Warning said to go to a safe room away from windows, and from the movies I'd seen I knew to go into a closet, and so I did. Not long after, the lights flickered a few more times, then electricity was out. I was thrown into darkness and the house was silent. No more TV to muffle the sound of the storm. For hours I was in the closet listening to wind howling, tree branches cracking and slamming into the house, lighting booming. It traumatized me so much I had a phobia of storms for years after. I literally could not be at home alone during a storm. I would run out of the house and jump on the bus and go anywhere there was people. Silly to look back on it now as an adult, lol. My mother had some pretty scary abusive rages. I have a clear memory of one that happened to occur in front of a full-length mirror, so I see the whole scene, including me in my memory. I remember asking my mother to kill me because I thought it wasn't fair to just keep torturing me. Just finish the job or leave me alone. I really meant it, too. I was probably around 7 to 8. I must have been about 3 my first time seeing the Queen's Guard, those red uniformed soldiers with the bear fur hats. I was shitting a brick and couldn't understand why my parents were so casual about standing and watching when we were clearly in such obvious peril. Not my experience, but my little brother found a dead body behind the church near our house when he was about 5. According to my mom, It was probably a body dump after a drug overdose or something. I don't remember, this was like 20 years ago. My brother had to go to a counselor for a while afterwards. It was really traumatic for him. My cousin and I decided to play doctor when we were 4 to 5. We were at my grandparents' house, and she wanted me to pretend to take my grandpa's heart pills. The bottle was open next to us, but I said I didn't want to. Our parents found us, saw the pill bottle, and assumed we took them. They called poison control, who I guess said I'd die of internal bleeding if I took any. They were all hysterically screaming at me to tell the truth, and saying I'd die if I didn't. I remember thinking that the only reason they would keep asking is if they had proof, and I started getting confused, and saying maybe. It eventually ended with them waiting and seeing while I had my first little panic attack. WTF, Mom? I read Malcyan too, graphic novels about a Holocaust survivor's story where the people are anthropomorphic animals, in 3rd grade. There's something about seeing police brutality and piles of dead bodies, even if they have animal features, that scared my young Jewish self shirtless. I developed major anxiety in the 3rd grade and didn't learn to deal with it until my adult life. Drunk grown man chases 7-year-old me down the street while screaming about a pretty lady. He tripped and busted his face, and lost a few teeth. I had my dad guard my bed for a week. I thought he was going to come back. When I was about 5 years old, my dad got blackout drunk on some Russian vodka that his friend brought over. He proceeded to yell at my mom, topple all the furniture in the hallway and smash it to pieces, break the glass door to the kitchen and break a body-length mirror in the hallway, at which point my mom went into a state of shock. She was unable to speak, just staring off into space and moaning. Crying, I walked her into the guest bedroom so she could lay down. I didn't know what was happening to her. My dad saw that little act of kindness, picked up a shard of the mirror, sat down on my mom's chest and pressed it to her throat, yelling and telling her that he'll kill her. I had to fight him off and I think we escaped to my aunt's house. My memory is a little fuzzy as to what happened after he tried to cut her throat. I've never told anyone about this before. In kindergarten, there was a girl who would come read to our class. One day she was reading to us and had a seizure. Literally 1 second she was holding the book and the next she collapsed to the floor, as our aides were trying to catch/hold her up. Of course as kids we didn't know what had happened. After a few minutes she eventually came to. Our teachers made sure to play it down because some of us thought she was dead. When I was maybe 10 to 12, my dad would take me on bike rides around the county roads near our house. One day his bike messed up and he did a nosedive right onto the asphalt. Broke his nose, started spewing blood. Luckily he was friends with the people across the road from where we crashed. He told me to wait on the side of the road while he went in to call my mom. There wasn't really any traffic in the area. He was trying to spare me from all the blood, but waiting alone not knowing what was going on made it so much worse for me. I followed him and after about 5 minutes, he was fine, just needed a nose splint or whatever. The funny/sad part was the neighbor whose house we were at was a sweet little old lady who patched him up, but her house was completely decorated in white. He was literally spraying blood all over her white house. He felt so bad about that. When I was like 10, I was in Boy Scouts and was on a camping trip with my troop. Some background: at this age I often slept walk. Well, one night I woke up in the middle of the pitch black woods. So I started wandering around and eventually found my way back to the campsite. Turns out I had walked half a mile barefoot in the freezing woods to an abandoned campsite. A cop almost killed me, my mom, and my cousin when I was 14. We were driving and about to go left around a blind curve and we see a car coming from that way. All of a sudden, no sirens, no lights, a cop comes speeding around the other driver, easily going 20 over the speed limit, which was 35. In a no passing zone, and barely makes it around the other car and back into his lane to not hit us head on. It felt like time stopped for a moment and everything moved slower that day. When I was about 2 or 3 I got bitten by fire ants on both of my legs. No one knew, obviously, that I was severely allergic to them and my airway started to close up. They put me in a bathtub with cold water and tried to put lime on my legs. I have no idea why. Before my uncle arrived and called an ambulance, last thing I remember was me laying on the stretcher and then getting into the ambulance. I later on woke up in hospital with my parents and brother next to me. The crazy part about this whole experience was that as a kid I grew up thinking it was all a dream because of how young I was. I was highly convinced it was just a nightmare and it had never happened to me. Until one day I told my mom about it and she told me that it had actually happened to me. I was knocking on my friend's front door when I was around 6 or 7, and a workman standing on the roof dropped a house brick. It nearly hit me on the head. It was so close. I was home alone for the first time and I was totally into Club Penguin. I was watching a video that said hack for free membership. The beginning of the video was fine, it was just a penguin at the iceberg. Then in the video, they clicked something 3 times and all of a sudden out of nowhere a picture of Jeff the Killer was flashing inverted and normally like a strobe light with loud screeching. I called my parents crying and nobody answered. And as embarrassing as it is, I almost called the cops. I was 4, very few memories of that early morning. I remember my father turning on the bedroom light. I shared the room with my 3 older siblings. I remember hugging him. And then I remember laying on my stomach looking down at my siblings' feet. A knife next to my head, policemen, paramedics, etc. I also have a very quick memory of being wheeled into a room. My father snapped on a drug bench. Later he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and various other mental illnesses. We lost a sibling. I almost died. He attacked us all. In childhood? Okay. My bedroom was in a converted garage when I was 4 and 5. If I had to get up to pee in the middle of the night I had to venture through the laundry room, then up a couple stairs to the kitchen door, then to the bathroom. Of course all the light switches were on the opposite end of the journey. That was some terrifying shit for a 5-year-old. That regular big glass of milk before bed scarred my existence. This story is the reason why I decided not to get a summer job as a lifeguard. I was around 13 years old. A friend and I had gone down to a river that was pretty popular for swimming and fishing. We got to our usual little spot to set down our stuff and waded into the water, about waist deep. I wanted to get completely wet and swim around a bit, so I, knowing that I'm a strong swimmer that won't drown because of a current, decided to go into the deeper part, probably like 12 feet deep. My friend wanted to join me, and I warned her that it was deep and that there might be a current. She kinda just ignored that and waded over to the little drop-off. Next thing I know, she's flailing around and yelling for me. She can't swim. I tried grabbing her arm to drag her to the shallow part, but she pushed me under and started to stand on my back. I couldn't get her off, and any time that I thought I was about to make it back up, she pushed me underwater again to stand on me. Luckily, I was able to shove her off, smack her, then drag her out of the water. Almost drowning is absolutely horrifying. Feeling that vulnerable and close to death is something I never ever want to experience. It scared me away from water and from swimming with people for a good while. Remember you all, if someone is drowning and they try to use you as a float, just hit them, then get them to safety. When I was 6, my mother was giving me and my little sister a bath. When suddenly the bathroom door had been kicked open and I saw a bunch of men in masks with guns. I just remember them yelling at my mom. She hurried up to get us in towels and in another room where they wanted us. As we were moving to the other room I saw my grandma and my dad laying face down on the living room floor handcuffed with guns pointed. I was absolutely terrified. It was the police. Turns out my uncle who hated my dad told the police that my parents were living with a big-time drug dealer, their roommate. Eventually they figured out there were no drugs. And he was just selling a little weed here and there. The cops shamed my mom for living with someone like that with young kids in the house. But still to this day I don't understand how that even happened and how that escalated the way it did. I'll never forget that though, seeing a gun pointed at my dad and grandma was absolutely terrifying. When I was around 12 years old I remember helping my mom get the groceries from the car. In one trip I forgot to close the house door behind me and my little chihuahua got out to the street without me noticing, but my mom did and told me to go get her. When I was turning in a corner I caught a glimpse of my dog laying in the street with blood besides her and I knew I messed up and ran home crying. My mom noticed and was furious, so she went to get the dog, brought her home and forced me to look at it while I cried. I remember it had her face torn in half, no jaw and one eyeball was hanging from the side. All while my mom was screaming, "Look at what you did." I remember it clear as day. My mom handed her to me and told me to go bury her. It was awful. We were in Illinois getting ready to cross the Ohio River into Kentucky headed to see my relatives. This bridge was a steel bridge from the late 1800s, narrow, barely 2 lanes. As my parents were crossing, an 18-wheeler nearly sideswiped them and we almost ended up in the river. I have an insanely crippling fear of steel bridges and water now. I was probably 3 or 4 at the time. When I was 13 I went on a school camp and one of the things we did was go bushwalking. It had been rainy recently so going back down the mountain was a bit slippery. I slid down off the path and slid long enough for panic to set it. I was so afraid I'd start rolling down the mountain, I couldn't vocalize how scared I was. I stuck my hand out and managed to grab onto a tree, swung around the trunk and put both arms around it to calm down. I was a bit shaky on the way down but don't think anyone noticed cause I couldn't vocalize anything. One time, I was going to another school for MPAs, musical performance assessments. It was located in the ghetto and my mom was a little worried, but she thought that it'd be fine since there would be cops at such a large event with so many expensive things anyway. As we were packing up all of our instruments afterwards, I had a sudden really bad urge to pee, to the point where I was just going to pee everywhere. So I went to the bathroom. One of the student volunteers offered to come with me, and we made some small talk on the way there. When we were almost there, though, some guy in a hoodie that I noticed following us for a minute or two suddenly attacked the guy, tearing at his throat with a shard of glass. He then fled, and I don't know what to do. I'm applying pressure to the wound, but blood is just all over the place. As I'm calling for help, I'm checking his pulse. Keep in mind that this was after school hours and we were in a part of the school that nobody was supposed to be in, so it was several minutes before a cop arrived. His pulse is weakening and I tell the cop what happened, and he starts CPR or whatever, but he didn't survive. Some kid just died and I couldn't do anything to help him. Fortunately, I don't have nightmares about it since my nightmares have always focused on the abstract, but I occasionally still remember it. I didn't even know his name. Don't know whether I should talk about this cause it still troubles me to this day, and I am just gonna say the experience haphazardly, so forgive me about that. Basically I was around 4 years old when my family got a new maid. She turned out to be one of the worst person I have ever met, and kept physically and mentally abusing me. Lasted for a year before we got another maid. Also, she was very careful about it, she won't abuse me unless my parents are out. My older bro also got bullied by her. He was 7 years old then, but he didn't get bullied as much as I did. Both of us didn't talk about the abusing until we got much older. Well, I was maybe 7, had just thought of something scary. I'm home alone and I lift my mom's crappy Dell laptop to go to her room because I'm scared, and then as I stand up like in a horror movie the power goes out. I'm screaming on the floor and I am staying there, not moving a muscle until the power came on, thinking a demon is standing next to me. Oh boy was I scared. I had experimental surgery as a kid, on some nerves in my spine, and I wasn't at all scared until I saw an anatomical drawing of the spine, and 6-year-old me thought the incision was going to be the entire length of my spine. It's only my lower back, but I don't know how long it actually is because I can't see it. Someday I should ask my best friend to measure it, I'm pretty sure she'd be willing. Thought I locked myself out of my own house early in the AMs to let a cat out, and the neighbors offered to adopt me from my constant banging on the door. I was 6. I remember my 3-year-old sister had her face bitten by my aunt's dog, my aunt then covered in my sister's blood crying, and my aunt's boyfriend grabbing the dog by the throat and slamming him into the pavement multiple times. He was a big, biker type of guy. Never saw the dog again. Sister ended up okay. I had a massive fear of dogs for years after that. When I was about 4 years old, 2 neighbor kids tied me up to a tree and threatened me with a butcher knife. They made a small cut and I guess I screamed loud enough for my mom to hear and come to my rescue. These were the same kids who stole my Tonka trucks and were playing with them in front of my mom and me while the parents completely denied it. As you might guess, they didn't amount to much as adults. My mother had a postpartum psychotic episode where she heard voices telling her to kill me and my newborn brother. She chased me with a knife before my dad locked her in the hall closet and called for help. She was involuntarily committed for 8 months. When I was 7 we lived in the projects and our apartment was 3 rooms, a bedroom, a bathroom and a living room/kitchen. Our neighbor regularly beat his wife and we heard it through the paper-thin sheared wall. One night it got really bad and my mother left to call 911 from a neighbor's apartment, as we didn't have a phone. While she was gone, our neighbor began pushing and throwing his wife against the sheared wall. It was forceful enough to move the stove in our apartment. The kitchen was just a row of appliances against one wall of the living room. I've never heard a woman scream like this woman did. I was sure one or both of them were coming through that wall. Before my mother got back, the screaming stopped. Our neighbor killed his wife. We moved 2 days later. My little sister threw a sledgehammer at me and just barely missed my head. She just chucked it at me with all her might. I had a full-blown panic attack and my sister got the "you need to be careful, she could have been killed," and I got the "it's not like you got hit, calm down." Still don't like her very much. I was a teenager, still am, and was on vacation in Hawaii with a family. We decided to do this downhill biking thing, see the sights on a mountain and stuff. My uncle and I went together. I was not wanting to do it. We get to the place, turns out it was worse than I was expecting. It's not a leisurely stroll down a mountain, no, you have to go like 20 miles per hour down a road with cars coming the other way. Against my better judgment, I try it, and not even 5 minutes in, my handlebars are shaking when I try to make a turn. I didn't make the turn. I was turning left and it was either go right and go off the side of the mountain, or veer left and hopefully don't get hit by a car and hit the guardrail. I hit the guardrail and fell and slid for a good 10 feet. Tore up my knees, elbow, and hand, and sprained my shoulder pretty bad. Could barely open a door for 2 weeks, but just thinking about if I hadn't turned left, or hit the guardrail at the right angle to fall over to the right instead of fly over it, or if there was a car coming, is kinda scary. Luckily the guys running the trip were very helpful. They actually picked some aloe off a tree for me and found me a cool chameleon to hold for a bit to distract me. My cousin's 2 cousins, uncle, and uncle's girlfriend were murdered by the one cousin's baby daddy. He used a crowbar and hit them all in the center of their forehead and lit the bodies on fire. His 1-year-old daughter was there and he put her in her car seat in a car outside the house. I'm from a town of 5,000 and this horrible quadruple homicide freaked me out for a couple years. Nearly got my head caught in between an automatic door and a wall. The friend who was with me was laughing, but I didn't find it funny. Once when I was like 13, 14, my middle school math teacher called my parents about my grade. Well, mom just chews me out calling me stupid. How could I made her look bad? I knew better than to get a failing grade. I got angry because she wasn't listening to me, so I snatched the TV remote up off the arm of the love set and Hulk smashed it to the ground. Now my dad had been sitting on the couch watching football up till this point. So as I'm walking away I can hear him get up off the couch. By this time I knew I'd done mess up, so I start to run to my bedroom. Dad was running behind me and shoved his way into my room before I could even close the door. Throws me down on my bed and he was chalking me. I remember my glasses being knocked off and just going limp, not know what to do. Mom was the doorway and all she said was, "Now come on, Dad's name, you don't need to get upset, it will raise your blood pressure." Feel like forever, but the chalking couldn't have been no more than a few seconds. Anyway, after that I learned to not be a little shit and Hulk smashed things around the house, so I guess in the end Dad's brand of discipline worked. I came home from school to a completely blacked out SUV in my driveway and a large man in a dark suit on the front porch yelling back and forth with my father. And that's when I learned if you don't pay your taxes long enough, the IRS sends someone out to remind you. This is old school kid play that nearly didn't work out so well. Down on our farm we rotated a new breeding bull in every year. Some we mostly tame, so were like wild buffaloes but all dangerous. I started playing games where I would approach the new bulls, irritate them and get them to charge at me, and then slickly climb up an apple tree, or slide under a fence before they could get at me. I was showing off for some cousins in from Ohio and got a little too far away from the fence, and as I looked back to check the run distance, I turned back and saw the bull I had planned to irritate was already headed toward me full speed. There was one move I had been practicing where I'd just dove down flat at the edge of the fence line while on a full running gait, and then snap roll under, doing this a full speed on the run. They moves saved my ass as this bull was right on me by the time I made it to the fence, and I could feel and hear one of his long horns ripping into the ground at my feet as I landed my move, and actually saw one horn cutting through the grass where my body had been a split second before. The snap roll put me safely under the fence. That horn went on plowing up through the ground, making an awful ripping sound. My cousins were white as a sheet and firmly attested they thought I was about to be killed. I kinda joked it off as a big 9-year-old might, but soon realized I had nearly been killed, got stomach sick and threw up all over myself. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.